dip my toe into this debate for a few moments. It's an important issue, and I want to commend the mover of the motion, the MP for St. John's South, Mount Pearl. The motion, as you are aware, says that the federal government must respect its promise to Newfoundland and Labrador of $400 million for development of renewal based on a 70-30 split through the province's Fishery Investment Fund in exchange for lifting minimum processing requirements as part of the Canada-European Union Comprehensive Economic Trade Agreement. Now, Mr. Speaker, why this is so important and why it was brought forward by this member is because the Province of Nova Scotia, under the undertaking of the federal government, they have a piece of legislation that they, within their provincial jurisdiction, with respect to mandatory minimum processing requirements, that has some influence over the processing of fish in Newfoundland and Labrador, that it's not scooped out of the ocean and then processed either on these factory freezer trawlers or shipped round over to Europe or somewhere else. And it was there, and Newfoundland and Labrador have held on to this legislation because it does create jobs in many communities, outports and otherwise, throughout Newfoundland and Labrador. So it's an important economic driver in that province, and they are probably unique. Quebec also has similar requirements, but they are not as adhered to as closely in that province as they are in Newfoundland, Labrador. So when the CETA was being negotiated, the European community, Mr. Speaker, in fact demanded that Canada get rid of this particular legislation in Newfoundland and Labrador that would somehow give a province within our jurisdiction preference. They wanted, of course, any of the product that was caught on our shores to simply, if they could manage it, to simply go to Europe and be processed there. That's what the thinking was. But what's curious on this is that it was the European community when they began to engage with Canada on the negotiation of this trade deal. It was the European community that said to Canada, we want to do this, we want to engage in these negotiations, but we know how your country is set up. It's a federation. We know how many powers your provinces have, and we want to have them at the table, or at least close enough to the table, that we understand if we sign off on various provisions with you, with the federal government, that we have the agreement of the provinces. And this was one of the issues. Matters with respect to the dairy industry, supply management issues. That was another matter that affected the provinces, as was the European community's attempt to extend the patent protection, Mr. Speaker, by another number of years, which would add $1 billion of costs overall to this country and many hundreds of millions of dollars individually to some provinces. So just on those three items alone, it was important for the European community to have the provinces at the table. Well, in some of those instances, the populations in those provinces, they were concerned about the impact of giving up minimum processing requirements in Newfoundland and Labrador. Many provinces became increasingly concerned about the impact on their health budgets as a result of the extension of the patent legislation. So too was the dairy industry in some provinces, in particular in Quebec, as it related to cheese and other milk products. They were concerned, and so they began to put pressure on the government. Now, I've certainly had the opportunity to talk to a number of provincial officials about these very items, Mr. Speaker, and we've heard it talked about in this House. And the federal government, in order to get this deal battened down, in order to get it tied down on those issues, they gave assurances to the provinces. In the case of extending the patent legislation, which would increase, potentially increase the cost of pharmaceuticals, they said to the provinces, don't worry, we don't believe that to be the case, but if it is the case, we got your back. We'll backstop you. We'll make sure that if there are increased costs in terms of the impact of extending the patent legislation, that we'll make sure that we cover that off. And for some provinces, Nova Scotia was one, Ontario was another, Quebec was another. They got that agreement, they got those assurances from the federal government, and they agreed that they would allow this to go forward. So too in the dairy industry. There were assurances made, and I've spoken to people in the dairy industry, Mr. Speaker, and we've spoken to various officials in the provinces, and again, the federal government gave assurances to the industry and to the provinces that they would be compensated. In the case of Newfoundland and Labrador, in the case of this particular matter of minimum processing requirements, it's a policy that's been around, I don't know, maybe 30 years or more, Mr. Speaker. But it exists in an industry that generates 1.1, this is in 2013, $1.1 billion in production value, and they provide direct employment of more than 18,000 people, mainly in rural parts of the province. So the restrictions on minimum processing requirements is extremely important to that province, and it's something that's held to by people in the industry and by municipal officials and others in various communities throughout Newfoundland and Labrador. And so when they understood that this was on the table, that the province of Newfoundland and Labrador, that the federal government was going to be negotiating away, there was quite an outcry. There was quite an outcry, Mr. Speaker, because fair to say the fishing industry in Newfoundland and Labrador, particularly as it relates to the cod fishery, has been experiencing some problems, but the stocks have been rebounding, and what people are concerned about is that if the government gives away those rights, if they abolish that legislation now, that when stocks return and when there's a requirement for greater processing, that there's no longer going to be any requirement that fishing companies bring their product onshore in order to be processed. So there was quite an uproar about it, and what the government said very clearly to the province, to provincial officials, is don't worry, we're going to contribute to a $400 million fund at the tune of 70% in order to make sure that you are properly compensated for any impacts that may arise as a result of losing that minimum processing that legislation with respect to minimum processing, Mr. Speaker. That was the deal. I've heard it. I was part of the trade committee that was in Halifax that heard witnesses from Atlantic Canada, and that was the understanding that people in the industry had. It was very clearly communicated from the government and by provincial officials that it was negotiated on behalf of the Conservative government of Newfoundland and Labrador and between this government, Mr. Speaker, that in order to make sure that that part of the deal was checked off with respect to CETA, that they would kick in to a fund, the federal government would kick into a fund 70% of $400 million in order to make sure that they deal with the adjustment caused by losing this legislation. That's the issue. That's why the motion is so important. We call on this government, Mr. Speaker, to stand by their provinces, to stand by their promises, and to stand by their provinces.
Questions and comments. The honourable member for Cardigan.
Mr. Speaker, and I thank my honourable colleague from Dartmouth for his important words. I would just like to ask him a couple of questions. Does he feel that the Government of Canada needed or wanted very much the Newfoundland support, and that's why they indicated that they were going to take part in this $400 million deal, which would be $280 million by the federal and $120 by the province? I understand the minimum processing requirement and how important it would be for the province, but in order to give that up, there had to be some compensation in place. Now, as I understand it, and the announcement that was made in 2013, the Premier indicated that this was for development and renewal, as well as for displacement. And now the terminology has changed. So I believe this is a very dangerous way for the Government of Canada to negotiate with provinces. And also, Mr. Speaker, there's no way that the Government of Canada does not have the money, because DFO, over the last number of years, just returned approximately $1 billion to the Treasury Board.
Honourable member for Dartmouth Cole Harbour.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate that question from my colleague, someone who knows a great deal about the fishery in Atlantic Canada, and he knows as well as I do just how important that requirement, the minimum processing requirement, was in Newfoundland and Labrador. As I said before, there's no question that the industry, with respect to groundfish, is in a bit of a slow period, but people recognize that if the industry comes back, which they fully expect it will, stocks are improving in cod and they fully expect that it'll come back. They want to make sure that that minimum processing requirement is there. And I don't think there's any question that the federal government believed that in order to nail this deal down, that they had to have Newfoundland and Labrador on board. And so they committed the $280 million, the 70% of $400 million, Mr. Speaker, to deal with the effects, to deal with the whole question of developing the industry, the fishing industry within that province. That was the commitment.
Questions and comments. The honourable member for Henri-Mercier. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In this federalism, the federal government must have good relationships with the provinces. That starts with dialogue, because it's important that if we make compromises between levels of governments, they need to be successful. When the government of Newfoundland and Labrador said, yes, we will support CETA, but given that there are going to be job losses, the federal government said, don't worry, we commit to giving you some money to compensate that. This was undertaken last year. And within the space of a couple of weeks, the government completely changed direction. What we're seeing here is a weakening of our democracy, of our federalism, if the central government is not able to respect its commitments to the provinces. The government works for Canadians. So, yes, we're going to have a free trade agreement, we're going to have better access to Europe, etc. But if we lose jobs, something needs to be done to compensate that. So there needs to be trust between the provinces and the federal government if they are to be able to work together. The honourable member for Dartmouth, Pearl Harbor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank my colleague for the question. And she's absolutely right. This is an incredibly important industry to the economy of Newfoundland and Labrador. The federal government, in the process of these negotiations with the European community, made very clear commitments to the people of Newfoundland and Labrador, to the government of Newfoundland and Labrador, to make sure that this fund would be available to deal with transition. They made that clear, and the government operated, the provincial government operated on that basis, Mr. Speaker. It was an investment in the fishery of Newfoundland and Labrador, and it was meant to make sure that not only were the effects of the loss of the minimum processing requirements legislation